You know, back in the past, there used to be a marketing slogan back when Sega was actually relevant about how Sega does what Nintendo don't.
It's free. What Nintendo.
But this time, Sega actually did what Nintendo do. God, that feels like such a horrible boomer pun to be making. Because they actually decided to sue another, much smaller company than they are over patent infringement. And you might be wondering why we are talking about this case when we completely ignored the Nintendo one before. It's not because of the fact that I'm some kind of fanboy or something. I hate both of these companies with facts. No, actually that's not right. I actually do despise Nintendo a lot more when it comes to stuff they do outside of their games. But that said, the Nintendo case kind of happened at a period where I kind of was already doing like weekly videos for almost a month straight, and weekly videos do take a toll on my health, so we decided to skip past that. Plus, there was a lot of misinformation out there because of the fact that there just simply wasn't any actual information about the patents infringed at the time, and so I decided to just hold back on that and wait for proper information to come out, because at the time there were so many big channels just spewing misinformation about exactly what the patents infringed were, talking about how it was this or that, even though realistically no one, not even Nintendo nor Pocket Pad themselves, had even come out talking about the patents yet. But with this case, we kind of have a unique situation where we do already know what the patents are, as they were actually released directly at the same time with all of the information about this lawsuit happening. And as someone who works in the industry, I find this to be a very interesting and unique case, because this is not the process that we have been seeing in the past few years where companies have sued each other. And so I wanted to talk about this and explain more how all of these patent lawsuits tend to happen and what they tend to entail and why they are basically a problem in the way that they are now. So for those of you who do not know what exactly is happening, since most big YouTubers just completely ignored this case instead, since it doesn't involve everybody's favorite company to hate, Sega has decided to sue a company called Bank of Innovation, which is a company that makes largely mobile games, which, in spite of the name, no, you can't actually withdraw any of the money you've deposited into your gacha waifus. Company of a size of about 170 plus people thereabout that has been running since 2006. The most popular title they have running now is Memento Mori, a game which initially picked up some level of traction almost exclusively within Japan, since it only released in one language, mostly because of the unique art style that it had and the fact that each character released with its own like character song simultaneously at the time. So a lot of effort was going into playing up the characters. People were actually praising its story, although arguably I would say that the gameplay itself was severely lacking, more so than the usual memes about like haha, gacha games have no gameplay. I'm talking about this game was a lot closer to something of the Rage of Bahamut or the very first Million Arthur levels of incremental, you really don't do anything at all. Everything just autos itself and you just have to tap the screen every once in a while sort of level of gameplay. So to me, the fact that this game was as successful as it was kind of strange to begin with, because games have actually shifted within this space towards having a lot more gameplay than they used to back in the day. Another interesting thing about this lawsuit is also the fact that Sega is not just suing them specifically for the currently only operating title, but also over the previous title that has already ended service. So it would seem that the motivations behind this are not to just simply get rid of the game that they have in operation or something to that extent because they find it to be a competitor that they don't want to deal with, but it would seem that monetary gain seemed to be quite on the table as well. And we can also see this from the fact that the amount that they were being sued for was announced right off the bat, unlike with the Nintendo Pocket Pair case where the monetary amount did not actually get announced even till this day. And we can see this from the amount that they were being sued for as well, which was billion yen, announced on the day that all of these proceedings were also announced. When you compare it to the Cygames Konami case, this time around they're being sued for about a quarter of that amount, which might sound small, but we have to remember that we're talking about a company that is much smaller in scale than something like Cygames, and so the amount is actually a lot more significant when compared to how much the company actually earns. Plus, with the case that we're talking about today, the ending of Memento Mori, if it actually reaches the point where they lose the case and they're forced to shutter the game, would actually be a lot more damaging as compared to with Cygames, where yeah, sure, Uma Musume is a very big title that they earn a lot from. But with Bank of Innovation, Memento Mori is the only game that they have in operation right now. And it was so significant that at one point it actually made up 90% of the company's income. So closing of this game and having to pay damages very well could kill the company, unlike the case of something like Cygames, where they're actually just a subsidiary of a much bigger company that does not deal just specifically with games. Now, when it comes to the patents themselves, thankfully, unlike every other case prior to this one, with this time we actually know what patents they're actually being sued for specifically, as all of this has been announced by the companies. There's a total of 5. That's quite average, I guess, maybe a little on the low side, but it gives us a good example of what a typical patent lawsuit looks like. Typically, a company does not sue over just one patent, which is something that many people seem to hyper-focus into when talking about the Nintendo Pocket Pair case. For example, when we look at the 5 patents that were brought up in this case, we can see that for the most part, there are quite a few that are very different from each other. The first patent, 5930111, actually states that it's about when there are multiple identical characters in a card-based fighting game, you have the right to adjust parameters to give an advantage in the fight. Even though this says card-based, the word card-based can actually be interpreted in very different ways, and as a result, even for something such as Memento Mori, where you're showing character icons and HP, because of the fact that the character's stats are all presented on something that may be considerable a card, they can then argue that perhaps this is something similar to the card-based fighting game style that they're talking about within their game, and therefore this is something that they can bring up as well. The second one is basically your spark or pity system. The third one is a simplification of the UI when you're like combining units or items and you are trying to combine multiple of them at a time. Then meanwhile, the fourth and fifth patents are derivations of the third and second patent respectively. So what we can see is that through the combination of the 5 patents that I mentioned here, they are going after 3 different systems within the game, with a hyper focus in on the specificities for 2 of these. So when it comes to patent lawsuits for Japanese games in particular, in order to patent a system, your patent needs to be very specific. You can't just say, I'm going to patent the concept of leveling up a character to gain stats, because that's too generic and therefore is unlikely to get accepted. Instead, it has to hyper focus into very specific steps in a process to show how this whole process is very unique. And we only need to look at the patents that are being brought up in this specific example, and we can already see this. When it comes to patent 7411307, what we do see is that this patent comprises 3 key steps or components, basically the main segments that the company wants to patent. And additionally, what we do see is that this patent has about 247 different individual unique steps that go through in the process, and all of these are being logged separately, and this is typically what you would need to go through in order for it to be considered wholly unique, especially when it's for a system that is overall already fairly used, such as in this case, where we are talking about a very specific type of spark system in a mobile game, or I guess a guaranteed pity system, wherein you would roll up to an X number of times and then you would get the character guaranteed. This kind of systems, like almost every game out there, has it in some way, and in order to avoid all of these patents, you would then need to do everything in a fairly specific set of steps in order to be able to then step around it and have something that is unique and safe. And when we look at the first point of application within this patent, we see that they're going quite in-depth into the type of pity spark system that they're trying to patent. So for this one, it actually states that where you have multiple different gacha banners going on at the same time, if you were to expand the resources you have on one of them, not only do you get the characters of the stated rarity that are stated to be available in the gacha, but aside from that, you also get a cumulative number, and this cumulative number would then stack up and is shared across multiple different banners. It then states that when the player actually reaches the cumulative points required for point number 1 and the point number 2, which actually requires even more points than point number 1, then the player will also be given a random character of the highest rarity from within the banner that they are rolling for as well. Then finally, it states that when the player gets to point number 3 among all of the cumulative points, the player then gets the ability to select one of the characters that is previously aforementioned in point number 1 as well. So as you can see, it actually specifies right down to the fact that there are 3 different cumulative points. The specification of the number of points here, it's also very important to whether or not this system can actually be passed as a patent, simply because you need to specify right down to the number of actions or the number of hoops the player has to jump through in order for the system to be complete. And remember, we're only talking about one of the three things that they're trying to apply for in the patent so far. When you look at both the second and third thing that they're applying for, number one is just the step of how you process all of the information for the system to work. The second point of application is the specific steps in how the entirety of this process would be, well, processed. And the third one goes through the individual steps for how the reward that you get for reaching these specific cumulative points will actually be provided to the player. So it's not just about saying that like, oh, my patent is going through steps A, B, C, but you're really going through individually, like, this is how it's processing the information for all of these individual steps. This is how it is handling the actions that are required at each of the individual steps, and these are all of the individual steps that the game itself is going through when it's rewarding the players and doing everything else that it does. That said, when it comes to this specific lawsuit, the thing with it is that we don't know whether this would even lead to any form of conclusive ending whatsoever. The big issue is that with many of the previous lawsuits we have looked at prior to this one, including the Konami Cygames one, with these lawsuits, typically many of them are happening between very big companies, and as a result, both companies can kind of have this go on for multiple years. Even with the Nintendo Kodopra one, it was basically just a grind fest of both companies just burning money to fight a case that ended up in an inconclusive settlement instead. Yeah, Kodopra did lose in the sense that they settled for an amount of money outside of the court, which, you know, it's still a fairly big hit to their income. But many lawsuits do not actually reach the point like the Capcom Koei Tecmo one, where it actually reaches a conclusion where the courts actually hand down a decision, as typically by that point the amount that is awarded would probably be a lot lower than what is initially claimed in the lawsuit. And typically most companies don't go after these lawsuits specifically for the money involved, since, you know, while you do look at the titles and it looks like it's a very amazingly huge amount of money, typically, like with the case of Koei and Capcom, the amount that was eventually settled for was only 143 million. So that's 2 zeros less than was being requested for in this case. And you are basically having to pay a legal department to fight these lawsuits for potentially years on end. So it is not as profitable as one might think, and it's typically more about sending a statement or for impeding another company's ability to use specific systems that your company has already patented. That's it. The thing I really don't like about this case is that it really kind of, in a way, validates the point that I was a little worried about with the Nintendo case, which, since I didn't bring it up at the time between Nintendo and Pocket Pair, it never really got put into a video anywhere, is the fact that the Nintendo Pocket Pair case kind of set a precedent in a weird way within the industry for bigger companies to sue companies that are a lot smaller. As in the case of Bank of Innovation, this time we are talking about a company with a less than 200 employees. Yeah, they do kind of have a fair amount of investment money in them, but it is a company that is much smaller than many of the big titans that have gone around suing each other in the years prior. A lot of these things with all of these lawsuits, there's just kind of have always been a weird gentleman's agreement between all of the big firms to not sue anyone that is fairly small. And what I mean by this is that there is no actual protection that protects a small or even indie company to even a moderately sized company from lawsuits from a much bigger company in the game industry. The big companies just kind of came to an agreement that we don't want to stifle innovation too much with the fact that we are trying to fight this patent war, because realistically speaking, medium to small companies and even indie groups, they don't really have enough of a scale nor financial support to be able to set up a legal department that can go through all of the thousands upon thousands of patents that are constantly being churned out to ensure that they don't infringe on anything. And they definitely would not have the amount of money to fight a extended lawsuit against any of these companies either. And so it has always been this very weird, precarious, gray zone area where the companies is just like, yeah, we're not gonna touch them, we just let them do their thing and let them make their money, because we don't want to start a situation where everybody is kind of too worried to actually make something new because of the patents that exist out in the market. And with this specific case, it would seem that we are starting to see another case within this ongoing trend of companies potentially going after much smaller companies than they are, which the thing with all of this is that the cases only come to the public in the way that they do now when companies actually kind of break down at the negotiation phase and actually have the confidence to bring it to court and are willing to actually announce to the public that this case is happening. If a much smaller company gets leaned in on a much bigger company and they just choose to fold and say, okay, we'll stop making the game or we'll remove the systems from the game, and they just don't announce any of it out of fear of some form of retaliation, then we'll never hear about those cases, right? Well, we might want to think that this is a very isolated incident. It may not necessarily be the case, because only the cases that get to court are cases that we actually get to hear about. And with the trend that Nintendo has set up now, while it is true that in Nintendo's case, people might argue that there is a lot more reason for Nintendo to feel justified in going through this lawsuit. And it's also a fact that it sets a very horrible precedent for the industry, because of the fact that it basically shows that you can actually, in situations, go after much smaller companies. And because of the fact that you have a much bigger brand, you do have people who will support your brand. And if you can portray yourself in the right light, people are more than willing to support you over social media as well, that you can then go and sue a much smaller company that may not have the ability to win the marketing side war either. So yeah, it's a little bit worrying. We'll have to see how this case goes. My bet is on that it will probably drag out for a few years, and then Bank of Innovation will probably just like settle the case outside of court, because it does not seem like the kind of case that they're gonna be able to financially sustain for the long term. But we'll have to see. Maybe they are confident enough that they can win, and then we'll just see this case actually end in a win for the company that's being accused, the defendant. No, the accused instead. Which so far I don't think has actually happened. So in the worst case, we might actually see Memento Mori either close down or change its systems, and the company itself might go bust. But hopefully it doesn't reach that point. We'll talk more about this when the results of the case comes out, since yeah, with this one, there isn't really all too much to talk about going forward unless there's a major development. But since everything is already out in the open, most of the there isn't really as much to break down and in the middle of the court proceedings themselves. Rather, it will most likely be when all of this reaches its conclusion, we could then do a post-mortem on it and see how the case actually ended up and what actually went down in terms of how all of the patents themselves, whether or not they were infringed, was actually interpreted. But yeah, that's all for today's video. Thank you all for watching. I think somewhere along the road, I probably want to make a video going more in depth into the situation regarding like patents for games within the Japanese game industry, since this is something that, as someone who works in the industry, it does affect the way that development actually goes on here quite a fair bit, and it makes it a lot harder for companies to really like thrive or innovate in this space. So I kind of want to do a more in-depth deep dive into the concept of that itself and how it affects the industry, but that will be for the future, as I kind of want to both get a lot more information and like make a more detailed video about it. And I also need to make sure that it's not something that can get me in trouble, since companies here are actually quite litigious in more ways than one. So until next time, we'll be going back to the regular schedule. So hopefully the next video will be something you guys already can see on the schedule that is on Discord, which if you're not on there and you find this video interesting and want to see more of like what I'm planning for future videos, you can feel free to join the Discord. If you're interested in videos where I just talk about like doujin events or weeb events that happen in Japan, or I just talk about console games as well, all of those are on this channel. Sometimes I do talk about like game industry related stuff like this, or I'll make like fairly long form videos about that. But if you're interested in any of that, do feel free to like and subscribe. Thank you to the following very cool people for helping to support the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one. But until then, take care and bye-bye. And I did not hit the mic this time.